Okay. Because this is an accessibility talk, I do like to do a little bit of housekeeping before I begin. And I like to show off one feature I like about Google Slides, and it's probably the only one I like, but because I like it so much, I keep staying with Google Slides. If I wanted to, like say a conference did not have captions and there was someone who might need captions in the audience, I can turn on captions here, but I want to explain. I put them on large and I put the text position at the top. So I'm going to toggle them on and you can see that now I have captions at the top. And why I do that at the top is so when YouTube puts captions on, it doesn't, because these are now open captions, so you can't turn them on and off. But that is a great feature of Google Slides. If you're against them, if you do present at a conference, you're able to be a little bit more inclusive to our deaf and hard of hearing folks. The AI is not perfect, but it's a lot better than none. So, and then I do have images in the slide deck. Most of them are decorative and do not serve any context, so I won't be describing them. But if there is an image that adds context, I'll be describing it. But for folks who are watching later on video, the slide deck does have alternative text on the images so you can access them, not visually. And then the link to the slides is a bit.ly link DDD-A11Y-security. And I think that is all of the housekeeping I have. My name is AmyJune. I do Drupal a little bit, but I'm a core mentor. But right now, currently, I work for the Linux Foundation, and I serve as their community architect for the certification program. And you can ask me more about that later. But who am I to talk about accessibility? I am a hospice nurse by trade. I am disabled myself, so I understand how difficult it can be for some folks to do pretty straightforward tasks, as simple as something like checking their email and maybe getting some gated content. And I also help organize a accessibility meetup called Ally Talks, A11YTALKS. And that's an interesting database on YouTube if you want to know more about accessibility. We have videos on almost all sorts of different topics. This is Spot. He is my cat, and if there's any typos, I blame him because he likes to run across my keyboard. So what are we going to talk about today? We'll go over some basic accessibility concepts because I don't want to assume anyone's skill level, and there's some things that you should know coming into this. But we'll also talk about some specific guidelines around some of the things I talk about with security measures. And then we'll look at security protocols and what makes them somewhat inaccessible, and we'll talk about some alternatives that you can use to make your security on your site more inclusive. So first, we're going to look at WCAG guidelines. Sometimes people pronounce this as WCAG or WCAG. It doesn't matter. The goal for this set of documents is a shared standard for web content accessibility. And it's primarily developed for not only web content developers, but the people who develop our accessibility tools, the assistive technology, the people who write the web accessibility evaluation tools, and then anyone who sort of needs that standard for accessibility, some guidelines to cover. I do want to point out that, I don't know where my mouse is there we go. Nope. Accessibility, inclusion, and user experience are very different. But they can be very related. The more usable your assets are, the more accessible they are. The more accessible they are, the more usable they are to more people. POUR is an acronym for the 4 principles of accessibility. The first one being perceivable, meaning that your user, your content consumer, can access things by way of their senses. Operable means that they can identify the content and the interface tools and be able to use the necessary elements to engage with your assets. Understandable means that people understand your content and they can learn to use the interface as they go through your cycle. It's not drastically different from page to page. And then the one that we're talking about probably the most is robust. And we should be able to have our content consumers consume our content in any way that they choose. So we're talking about how they use it, like with assistive technology, how they're using it without assistive technology. So again, we'll probably focus more on operable and robust during the talk today. To break it down, those 4 concepts, we make sure that things are easy to see, so we accommodate visual needs. The Center for Disease Control estimates that 12 million people worldwide live with some sort of vision loss, and that's over 1 million people who are completely blind. But there's other things to take into account, not just visual loss, but there's things like cracked cell phone screens, or there's glare, or maybe you're on an old CRT. Motor needs, again, we want to make sure that people can interact with our assets. And this could be people who live with a palsy, maybe their hand shakes, maybe they're paraplegic and they don't have access to like some of their muscle control. But it can be folks like in situational things, like maybe a mother holding a child, and so they only have one hand, so they have to accommodate that. And then auditory needs, make sure that people can hear what you're offering, and that's why I turn on captions. It gives people another way of accessing your information. And this isn't just for our deaf and hard of hearing friends. These are like if you're in a noisy environment, or maybe you're in a quiet environment, they have the same thing. You can't hear it, or you don't want anyone else to hear it, so you turn on the captions. And then the last concept is the cognitive abilities, making sure that your content is easy to understand. This can include people who have brain injuries. It can be people who are distracted or have a difficult time focusing. So you kind of have to think outside the box of how our people consume our content. And remember, there's different types of disabilities. I just looked up this figure this morning that 16% of the world's population lives with some form of disability. That's 1 in 6. So there's not too many people in here, but one of us lives with a disability. And then remember, as we age, we become more disabled with time. And then there's things like recovering from LASIK. So those are our, situational disabilities. I told you about the mother on the bus holding the baby, and she uses the one hand to scroll. There's temporary disabilities, like you have a broken arm, which will be remedied in 6 to 8 weeks. We have permanent disabilities, people who live with our paraplegia or maybe that traumatic brain injury. But there's another one that I've been talking about in the last 6 months called an episodic disability. These are folks who have lifelong conditions that ebb and flow with their health. So things like diabetes or things like mental health, where at times they can function and do things on sort of a lack of a better word, normal sort of baseline, but at times their abilities, fluctuate. And we have to remember, too, that not every disability can be seen. There's fatigue, there's dizziness, there's brain injuries, there's the hearing and the vision loss. So remember, we can't always identify our users by their looks. So I am hard of hearing, and I do a lot of virtual meetings, and I recently worked for a company that would not provide me with the tools I needed because they called me an edge case. So I found this quote that I gave at all my presentations after that. When you call something an edge case, you're really defining the limits of who you care about. So accessibility is not about special privileges. It's about basic human rights. And in the disability community, there's a saying now that says society disables us. I can't access the stage because there's stairs. If there was a ramp, then everyone can access it. So think about that edge case scenario. Every person is unique. Every person is different. The more inclusive you are, the more people can use your products. Let's talk about what a user agent means. A user agent is any sort of assisted technology, and sometimes you'll see that abbreviated for AT for short. It's really any device or software or technology or equipment that helps people, assistive technology. It helps us work around the challenges that we face when we are learning and communicating and functioning on our digital assets. So screen readers usually are what people think of when they first hear about assistive technology, and these are used to listen to the content of a web page. They convert text to speech. We need to keep in mind that screen reader users also are people who use the screen reader to help them with the visuals on the web page. So it's not just people who have vision loss that are using screen readers. It might be to reinforce the content on the page. Screen magnification software, I don't know about you, but every year I have to use that Command++ a little bit more. You know, the stuff or fonts keep getting smaller. I'm not sure what it is, but screen magnification software, it's true to its name. It enlarges that screen content so people can see it. And I'm very tangential because I'm very passionate about accessibility. And something to think about, which doesn't have to do with security, but when you're talking about screen magnification, as I'm on my laptop and I magnify my screen, think about responsive design and how that works. You know, if all of a sudden everything becomes an accordion and you can't tab through something because I've enlarged it so much that it changes into a responsive state. Again, tangential. And there are other alternative input devices that folks don't know about. There's eye tracking. This is a system that monitors eye movement to control the mouse pointer, and it detects the blinking to initiate the mouse clicks. We have accelerators. These are programs that help reduce the effort needed to type or click. So think about if you have, you know, a mobility issue, can you use your keyboard? Can you click the mouse? You know, so we have accelerators that help us with that. We have pop-up and animation blockers. These are our browser extensions that prevent those annoying pop-ups from coming up. But this can help. This is important for people who have distractions. So that's why I like to talk about pop-up and animation blockers. People have mapping and do keyboard customization, and that can affect how they use your website. There's reading assistance. These are things like customizing font sizes, customizing light or dark mode, hiding less relevant parts of the web page or your asset so it's not distracting, like hiding a sidebar or hiding an ad. There's things like page maps where they look at a certain part of the page so they don't have to see other things. And this is a refreshable Braille device, if you're not familiar with what that looks like. So as the content is being read, that those dots dynamically raise so people can use Braille. Now moving into security, authentication is a really hard word for me to say, is really our first defense when it comes to security. When authentication requires user input, our best practices should include giving your users options and choices, and this is going to be kind of iterated as we go. Again, it's about giving your users choices and options on how they can authenticate. And there's some specific WCAG guidelines around this. 3.3.7, is accessible authentication. It talks about ensuring that you have an accessible, easy to use, and secure method to log in. And this benefits people with cognitive issues relating to memory. Remember, you know, having to type in codes and things like this. This can be dementia. This can be dissociated amnesia. It can be ADHD. It can be our dyslexic folks that have a hard time moving from one to another, you know, maybe their letters get mixed up. Dyscalculia, that's where you have the same thing with numbers. And then anyone who has perception processing limitations can find authentication a challenge. We're going to pause for a moment, and I'm going to be bold here, and I apologize, but in light of Pantheon's decision to host web presence of hate groups, I want everyone to remember when you choose your hosting platform, look at the acceptable use policy that the platform provides and make sure that they have the ability to prohibit hosting organizations designated as hate groups when adequate evidence is given that that group is a hate group. So if you want to talk to me more about this after the presentation, feel free, but hatred of any form is unacceptable. And I'll step down off my soapbox for that. Gated content. This is where it requires a user to complete a form, or maybe purchase a subscription to get to the content. This sometimes is used for lead generation in our marketing departments. The form can ask for the user's name, they can ask for the email address, or maybe they might demand more details, like typically about their jobs and organizations. So this is gated content. It's behind a wall that you access. Gated content can be anything. It can be white papers, articles and videos that require, again, people to fill out that form. Ebooks sometimes are behind gated content. Webinars and learning courses are usually behind a paywall, which is gated. Product demos will ask for the email so they can track you and sell a product. Sometimes to subscribe to a newsletter, email curations are behind walls. Restricted communities, like maybe your Discord communities or your discourse communities, along with things like surveys and contests and things like this. This is all falling under gated content. So what are some common security measures? The first one, the title, is a Captcha. We see Captchas all around. But what does that mean? Does anyone know what that acronym means? I didn't. So it means completely automated public Turing test to test computers, to tell computers and humans apart. Captcha. We've seen them as simple as an image. We've seen a checkbox asking if we're human. Sometimes we see images that we have to decipher. Sometimes we have to listen for letters or even do a math puzzle. And often, again, we see that checkbox. And this is a very complicated Captcha, if you can visually see this. The letters are really hard to read, and you're expected to read these letters and input them into this box. So here's a couple more forms of Captchas. We have a math equation. I don't know about you, but I haven't done that kind of math in a long time, so I'm not getting into that website. We've got our collage of images. Now think about if you can't see the image, how are you going to type in or click those boxes? Because you could provide alternative text, correct? But that defeats the purpose of having the Captcha because now our bot can see those alternative texts. And then we have an audio where you have to listen for the cue. So you can see how inaccessible some of these Captchas are. Not everyone can see the screen and identify. But providing, going back to that first, this one, sometimes we see simple math questions, and we think that those are straightforward, but they're not either because we have folks that, invert the numbers and have dyscalculia. So even, they can be as complex as this, but other people, might have a problem digesting 2 + 4 + 6. So even, those simple, or what some people call simple math equations aren't so simple. So we want to offer alternatives to Captchas that are accessible to your entire audience. And it includes people with the vision, the hearing, and the neurocognitive abilities. So it's all about not providing a single way, providing alternatives. And if we look back to the first one, you can see that we have that complicated Captcha, but there's also a link here that says try another text or audio Captcha. So we offer them the visual and we offer them the audio. So we're giving them options. And again, probably the most straightforward way is just to have that I am not a Captcha on that reCAPTCHA. Timers, sometimes we use timers or time-based words when we ask people to authenticate as a user. There's a guideline about giving enough time. That's the WCAG 2.2, provide users enough time to read and use the content. Not everyone can zip through a form or enter their credit card information at the same rate. So we have to give people a little bit of grace. I'm a big concert goer. I like to buy tickets. I'm sitting at my computer and I open my concert venue ticket and I'm doing everything and I see this timer and my credit card is upstairs. Well, some days I can't walk up the stairs as fast and I get a really good set of seats and I'm like on this race of going upstairs and coming back before that timer, So we want to make sure that we can adjust the timing for folks or that there is no timing. And of course, certain things we have to have timing. But be sure that interruptions can be postponed or suppressed by our users. And then when our session expires, I'm not sure why it's going in and out like that, but when our session expires, give them the option to renew that session. And then when we renew that session, have the data still on the page. How many times have you renewed your session and then all of a sudden your forms are blank? So something to think about. A lot of people have this cognitive load. They're distracted by the timer and then their input isn't there anymore. I kind of already went through this. So we want to make sure that people have time to complete their activities, and someone with a reading disability, such as dyslexia, might have take longer to read some of the forms and go through this. Someone who relies on screen reading software because they're blind or maybe they have some vision loss could take more time locating all of the elements on the page. And then understanding the layout as well. So think about your layout when you have time-based surveys and that kind of thing. And I think the WCAG criteria is unless the timer is longer than 20 minutes, all time sessions should be turned off or adjusted or extended unless it's essential for that activity. And that's a AAA, and I don't know much if you know much about compliance. It's that optimal compliance. The required compliance is AA, but again, it's that usability, making sure that, the most people can use your content. We have time-based one-time passwords. This can hinder people with sight, cognitive, or motor skill impairments. It might be difficult for someone who has a cognitive processing issue to take code from one screen to another in the designated time allotted. So again, adjust the timing, turn off the timing or extend the timing on those time-based one-time passwords. Lots of us have shortcuts that we know as developers. Sometimes we know to text ourselves the answer, or we have the app open on our computer. But think of our more geriatric patient or geriatric content consumers that don't have that savvy ability, that they're looking at one screen and transferring it to the next. So what are some other verification methods for making sure we say who we make sure our content consumers are who they say they are? We have biometrics. That refers to a person's physical or behavioral traits. So we have voice recognition. It's great, but what if someone has a sore throat and their voice is a little different that day? You're at DrupalCon and you're screaming over the party and your voice is different and you can't access your information. There could be loud music or a lot of noise going on in the background that will, hinder the voice input. Facial recognition. It does not require sight or hearing or significant motor skills. It makes it really ideal for a lot of users. But there are quite a few situations that can affect the ability to use facial recognition. And, we're coming out of a time where a lot of us were wearing masks. That affected our ability to use that biometric. But also we've got hijabs, we've got burqas, we've got other face coverings. We've got people who grew a beard during COVID, or maybe someone who's had weight fluctuations. And by the time they've used their facial recognition again, the composition of their face is different. Fingerprint scanning, iPhone for a while had the fingerprint scanning, which everyone thought was great. But maybe you've been shoveling snow and you have a blister on your finger, or maybe you've been gardening and you have dirt in the crevices of your fingerprint and you want to make a call real quick. You weren't able to do that fingerprint scanning. And eye recognition, this is great. It can tell twins apart because it uses the iris to disassociate the two. But think of cataracts or loss of an eye. Again, like things like fingerprint scanning. There's those people that might not, maybe they've lost a limb, maybe they don't have a hand. If that's your only method of input, think about like those people who are born with birth defects that didn't have any of their limbs. So, there's a lot of things to think about. Again, it's about giving people choices. So if you do have fingerprint scanning and your hands are dirty, maybe you have a passcode at the same time, or maybe you have something in conjunction with it. Multi-factor authentication, and we see this abbreviated as MFA. This is where sometimes we have These are a little bit less secure measures, but maybe we have texted codes that are sent to our apps. They are more common than the other ones because they're easy to use or they have wide availability. You go to your app store and you download them and there they are. But the trade-off is that users with difficulties who have difficulties typing codes quick. I don't know if any of you have the authentication for Drupal.org. That's a really quick one. Like you have to type that code in pretty quick, and it also is already like halfway through most of the time by the time it loads, and you're like, oh no, and you have to wait again, and you're trying to like block someone or you're trying to do something on Drupal.org. I'm just throwing us under the bus because it's our community, but we have things like email-based security codes. This is where our code is sent through email, and maybe your email has security measures as well. We have our authentication apps. You can see on the screen, I have a whole bunch of, it seems like every site you log into has a different authentication app that you want to use, but so here's some of the ones that I use, just as an example. We have things like connected tokens. That's where our users plug a dongle into their device, and maybe the second step is pressing a button or maybe having a keystroke it means that you don't usually have to enter the code. We see this sometimes when we are behind our gated computers with our companies, or maybe, what is it? VPNs. VPNs are sometimes with the dongle, so you don't have to continually log back into your VPN. We have single sign-on, SSO, and I think Drupal.org is moving towards single sign-on, which would be fantastic. It significantly reduces the friction because it only requires the user to do their passcode once instead of every time they log into a different thing. So single sign-on is a great alternative because you only have to do it once, so the burden is just the once. So let's talk about scanning IDs and certificates. It goes down to back to the usability. Things that require us to, prove our identity. These can be bank apps, where we're scanning our checks to deposit them. They can be vaccination records, but there was a time I'm from the United States where I had to have my vaccination record. If I wanted to go to a concert or into a restaurant, I had to have my vaccination record on an app. There's signature-based, certificate-based signatures, PDFs, which this is 2023. We should not be using PDFs, but that's a whole different talk. There's no reason why you should have a PDF at this. They're portable documents that are antiquated and they're not accessible, but they are a thing and they require scanning. We have things like testing platforms that use AI to finish our tasks. But if we think about who's using our sites, we have folks that might have that palsy. Maybe they live with Parkinson's. They have the paraplegia again. Maybe they live with Lou Gehrig's or ALS. Maybe, they were in a car accident and don't have access to some of their limbs. So they're not able to hold the document or the scanning device still enough to be able to scan that document. A person with low vision might not be able to line up that scanner in time. So when we think about using scanning IDs and certificates, we also want to give them an alternative way to do it. Maybe they can take a picture, where they don't have to hold the device steady. Or maybe you give them more time before it times out telling you that you weren't steady enough. So give them that, adjust the timing, give them an alternative to upload their documents, even if it's a link to do it in another way. A lot of these methods require input. So there is a WCAG guideline around input assistance, and it's 3.3. We want to make sure that we help users avoid and they have the ability to correct mistakes. Do you remember Drupal 7, how inline form errors became a thing? That was great because we gave people that visual inline reference to when they made a mistake. So if an input error is automatically detected, the item that is in error is identified, and the error is described to the user in text. That way it's easier for people to find. Providing information about the error in text allows people who are blind or colorblind to perceive it, because then they can use their or their screen reader device. So again, identifying that error in text form makes it more accessible to people who are using assistive technology. And this criteria really helps people with cognitive, language, and learning disabilities that have a difficult time understanding the meaning represented by icons and other visual cues. So lots of us, know the meaning of an icon, but if that icon doesn't have a label or that icon isn't described, some folks who can't see that don't have access to what's expected of them. 3.3.2 talks about labels and instructions. These first two are that 1A level. So these are the law, okay? The minimal you have to make your website compliant. So these are must-haves. So providing labels and instructions where the content requires input helps those people that are using those screen readers identify. But it's about providing clear and unambiguous labels. This helps all of our users, right? If you do it in a way that's just, there's a label, not everyone's gonna understand that. Remember, we live in a global society now where, we're connected through the internet. We might not have internationalization or localization. So using clear, concise words when you do error suggestions is really important. And talking about error suggestions, we have to make sure that the input error is automatically detected. We need to provide information about how to correct those errors again and allow users who have those learning disabilities to fill in the form successfully. So hidden passwords. You can see here in this image, well, if you can't, I'll describe it. I'm trying to log into Florida Drupal Camp at info@floridacamp.org, and I have my password and I can't see it, but there's an option to show the password. But sometimes we don't see that option to show the password, and we're not sure if we typed in 2 L's or 3 L's, or is it a 0 or whatever. So having the ability to show the password helps people identify things a little bit easier. When we talk about passwords, we should really allow copy and paste functionality, not just people who have the apps that will fill it in for us. So think about, giving your users the ability to copy from one, like I send myself a text message from my phone with my Drupal.org number, allow me to paste it into the input field. And then, also having the ability to allow tools to fill in credentials. I've seen this improve a lot over the years, but there still are some tools that don't allow you to have your password manager fill it in, and you have to copy and paste from one. So think about this as we're looking at like the options or the plugins or the extended modules we use for security. Allow more options for people to copy and paste, have those form labels, and allow our tools to do some of the work for people that can't do that themselves. A couple of notes about alerts, modals, and other pop-up-y things. All of us have our own level of annoyance when it comes to pop-ups, but our marketing teams love pop-ups. They love us to have that content. Some of us have ad blockers, but we can't use them because we have to turn off the ad blocker to access this thing, only to turn it off, right? So I want to talk a little bit about these because you can tell I'm not a fan. There are all kinds of WCAG guidelines around the operability of pop-ups. We have target size. So if you think about a pop-up that comes up, can someone pick up their phone and X that out so they can close it? So think about target size when you design your pop-up. Maybe you have larger fingers, or again, you have a palsy and you can't quite get that button. So think about target size when you think of pop-ups. Your focus order. Okay, your website opens up, and say I don't use a mouse and I use keyboard for navigation. Do I have to tab through absolutely everything to get to close that cookie consent or that pop-up? So think about your tab order when you think about accessibility. Because chances are, like, let's say you have a mega menu, halfway through the first item, I'm not on your website anymore. Because I can't close that pop-up, I'm going through all of those things. So think about the focus order of your pop-up. And then also think about the visible focus of your pop-up. Can people see where they are in that pop-up? Say you open up the pop-up and you can get in there. Can you see when that X is highlighted if you're tabbing through? Can you see when you're on the input field? So make sure that you have a visual indicator around all of your functionality, all of your operable elements. And that goes into keyboard operability. And then also, when your pop-up opens up and you're in there, do you have the ability to get out of that pop-up? Do you have ability to get out of that form? If you can't, that's called a keyboard trap, and that's also a AA compliance level. If people can't get into your website after that pop-up, you're in trouble. So remember, if you're able to tab into something, you should be able to tab out of it as well. So we've got JavaScript pop-up windows, and really, this is opinionated. You should only use these if they add a significant value in functionality. And then to think about it, lots of folks who find pop-ups annoying will have JavaScript disabled. So does your information display with having JavaScript disabled? Everyone should be able to access the content, whether or not, they have JavaScript enabled or not. When we think about pop-ups, we also think about scrolling. So we want to avoid disabling scroll bars because we want people to be able to scroll with them with their mouse. And then we also want people to understand that people with low vision, we need the scroll bar so they can accommodate bigger text. So we don't want to have a scroll bar on both sides because people can't, it's very complicated to use a scroll bar horizontally and vertically at the same time. So think about how you have your scroll bars displayed. Going back to the links, or adding labels for links. It's really important to understand that not everyone uses websites in the same way. So if a pop-up opens a new window or a new tab, then there should be a label that tells folks that that's what has happened. Because some folks might get confused because they try to use the back button and they can't get to it, not realizing that they've opened a new tab, especially on a mobile device. This is opensource.com's pop-up that pops up on Absolute. Well, it doesn't pop up anymore because opensource.com didn't align with Red Hat values and they disabled the site. But if it was still up, you can see that the pop-up has an X. It has clear labels. These aren't just like labels that can't be read. You can see your email and your location. But it was kind of annoying because you had to scroll through all of the elements on the page to get to that X. So just, again, think about your users. Status messages. As a developer, we see lots of status messages as we update. Sometimes as a content creator or editor, we see the status messages as we update our content. We want to make sure that our users are aware of any important changes that happen with our status messages, and in a way that doesn't interrupt their work. So I must have like a loose HDMI port or something. When appropriate roles or properties are associated with those status messages, the new content should be able to be read by a screen reader in a way that assists them. Most sighted users can see visually, but we want to make sure that our folks who don't see visually are aware of the status message as well. I have an image on the next slide, so we'll see it a little bit better. So possible uses of status messages, it could be, coming back with the number of research results. It could be informing that the user that the application is busy or unavailable. It could be displaying information about the progress or completion of a process. So if we look at this next one, we have our Drupal set message. And you can see it across the top. We've just updated an article. So it says, our status message is green with some text across it that says, 10 get tips we can't live without has been updated. But we want to provide people a way to turn off those non-essential alerts. Do I need that? Maybe I do, I don't know. But we also want to ensure the use of color and hidden icons are not used in a way that is only conveyed by sight. So think about if I am colorblind, or maybe my screen resolution is funky, or my vision is blurry, I don't have my glasses on, I might not be able to see that this is a green article, right? That this is a green banner, that means it's okay, good, right? We know that orange is a warning, we know that, red is a alert, but we also have that checkbox that lets us know. So we have two distinguishing ways to know that we've accomplished our tasks. But think about if it was only in the green, we might not know that that's a go message. And also we want to talk about, and this is Drupal, whether or not that color is accessible against that background. So we have these alert messages, do we have enough color contrast for people to see that is that it's updated? Again, not just people who live with vision loss, but people who have that, if you're outside, we work remote, you want to work outside on your palm tree or whatever, you have that sun shining against your screen. Okay, so what have we learned today? Again, it's about providing your users with alternatives. And some of the simple ones, and I just like to iterate them, is, really allow your users to copy and paste the details from one program into another. We want to allow people to use external references. This can either help with their memory or maybe avoid transcription errors, for our folks with dyslexia or dyscalculia. We want to provide a method to authenticate that does not necessarily require a password for those folks. We want to provide alternatives to Captcha. We see here that we have, again, we have a few different ways to do this. We have Captcha written out where we can identify it and pop it into that input field. But say we can't read some of those letters, so we have a refresh button that kind of helps people. Like they can't read one, maybe they can read the next one. But we also give them the alternative for sound. And then we also have a tooltip that maybe leads them to a different way to authenticate their information, or maybe it could be where it reads that alternative text for them. Again, when we have alternative text associated with our image, it defeats the purpose of having a Captcha in the first place. We want to avoid culturally specific Captchas. This doesn't necessarily tie to accessibility, but it ties to inclusion. Not everyone has the same cultural background, so we want to avoid things like, like maybe it's a sport that's only played in Australia and you're asked to identify the equipment. Well, I might not know that because I don't first do sports, and then second, I don't know Australian sports even more. So kind of avoid pop culture references or culturally specific Captchas. And I'm at time, and so again, it's about providing your users with alternatives. And does anyone have any questions before I release the room to the next person? Jürgen?
Yeah, Amy, thanks a lot for that. It's very insightful and helpful, but I'm really scared because I feel I can't get it right. There are so many requirements that we have to think about that I fear that if we leave that to each individual implementation of a website, nobody has the energy to every single time try it again and re-implement and reinvent the wheel and so on and so forth. So just in the Drupal ecosystem, shouldn't we think about, or maybe that already happened, to provide a tool set that makes it just selecting the right options to provide, and only the authentication process to provide something which is always correct and compliant?
So we don't currently have that in our ecosystem. We have individual measures, and then we have to install another one to have an alternative, right? So like I said, we're working on single sign-in, which will help. I don't know if that's going to be in the Drupal subset or just Drupal.org, but having that simple sign-on really helps with accessibility because it's just that one input, right? And again, accessibility is not hard, but it's not straightforward. So it's really doing that research of like, and I hate to say this, but it's about your user base, and really determining like who are your users, who's using your site, and then thinking about those people who come to your site later. So it's about the options. Does that answer anything? But there is no straightforward. It's like downloading one Captcha and then downloading another one and giving somebody options, and it's not in core. Anybody else? Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then if you did download or go to the slide deck, and I guess I'll put the slides on the session page, there are tools that you can use to evaluate your accessibility. I have links to these. And then I have the resources that I mentioned throughout the slides. So you can, kind of read up on some of the stuff I didn't elaborate on. Okay. Thank you.